Hello and welcome. I'm Austin Kovalarczyk, composer and arranger, bringing you episode 22 of my book review series. And typically when I pick a book for this series, I usually pick one out of a list of books that I'm looking to read or get my hands on, or, it's been recommended to me by a peer or a teacher, or it'll come up naturally somehow that I'm like, oh, I should talk about that one next. In this case, this was actually a gift from my mom for Christmas, because she thought it looked interesting. So thanks, Mom. Today's book, This Is Your Brain on Music by Daniel J. Levitin. Now, as you might be able to guess from the tabs, we'll be exploring this book a little differently than I usually do things around here. Usually, I, give an overview of the author, and then I'll give an overview of the book, a quick synopsis, talk about stuff in a little less of a biased way, and then I'll talk about how easy it is to get your hands in the book, and then I'll give my opinion. I try to give you all the facts about the book, unbiased before I talk, and kind of pollute your view with mine. However, I'm going to be very upfront today. I don't like this book. I think it's not a good book. I don't recommend it. And we're just going to be discussing some points represented by these here tabs, rather than, giving you a overview of the book and why it's like, oh, maybe you could go read this if you're this kind of person, or don't read it if you're this kind of person. I'm recommending that if you have any interest in being accurate in what you think about music, you don't read this book. Because I found a lot of flaws with it, and I'm going to take you through that little journey today because, as I mentioned, this was a Christmas gift. I'm recording this in March. That's how long it took me to read it. For context, a 300 or so page book like this, I can do in a day usually. 2 days, depending on what I've got going on. So, to help me discuss some of the points that I want to bring up about this book, I've enlisted the help of, let's call them friends. This pile is all sources from the bibliographical notes in the back here. Let me adjust this slightly. Those are all sources that Levitin cites. These are all several more sources I'll be citing, and because it is 2024, a lot of my sources are digital, so you'll be able to find those. I'll talk more on that later. Special attention should go, however, to A Field Guide to Lies and Statistics, a neuroscientist on how to make sense of a complex world, where I'll be drawing a lot of my information on misinformation from, and it'll be the source of a lot of quotes regarding that topic. This book is particularly special because, as you might have noticed from the cover picture I put up here, it was also written by Daniel J. Levitin. So we'll see just how well Daniel J. Levitin understands misinformation and how easily it can be propagated. So to discuss the tabs, I use a technique that I've seen on some other book review channels on YouTube, where each tab is specific types of issues that the reviewer has with the book. For example, we see a lot of blue. Blue is blatant misinformation. Yellow is things I don't agree with, and I wanted to research more before I called them misinformation. Pink will come up later. And green were things I genuinely thought he did well. You'll notice that there are not many of those. So, let's start. Right as you open the book, and I do mean right as you open the book, I'll start things off with a quote from his other book, actually, A Field Guide to Lies. The quote goes, "An old joke goes, how do you know when someone is lying to you? Because they begin with the phrase, to be perfectly honest. Honest people don't need to preface their remarks this way." End quote. Levitin says this, and then proceeds to open his book with 5 pages of reviews about how great this book is, and how well written it is, and how smart he is as a neuroscientist and a musician to have written this book. I'm not trying to point out any parallels, except that I am, just putting that out there. It's an interesting choice, to be certain. After this, trust me, bro, people love my book, so it's gotta be true, section, is the actual introduction of the book. Here, Levitin introduces a fair bit of background about himself, how he got into music, how he ended up going back to school for his doctorates, yada yada, personal information, personal story. For the majority of this, I do not have an issue. It's his personal story, I'm not gonna fact-check that. However, there is one little section that I immediately took offense to, It is a shame that many people are intimidated by the jargon musicians, music theorists, and cognitive scientists throw around. There is a specialized vocabulary in every field of inquiry. But in the case of music, music experts and scientists could do a better job of making their work accessible. This is something I try to accomplish in this book. So from this, we're supposed to get the idea that he's trying to make this book a little more approachable to the average reader. And this is supported again on page 12 by his own statement, "This book was written for the general reader and not for my colleagues, so I have tried to simplify topics without oversimplifying them," something oddly he repeats verbatim in his bibliographic notes, just in case you missed it, maybe? So logically, you would assume that he did his best to keep technical jargon, overly technical phrases and concepts out of this book, which is a worthwhile goal. Flipping to page 191 here. "We found exactly what we hoped. Listening to music caused a cascade of brain regions to become activated in a particular order. First, auditory cortex for initial processing of the components of the sound, then the frontal regions such as BA44 and BA47 that we had previously identified as being involved in processing musical structure and expectations. Finally, a network of regions, the mesolimbic system, involved in arousal, pleasure, and the transmission of opioids and the productions of dopamine, culminating in activation in the nucleus accumbens, and the cerebellum and basal ganglia were active throughout." Feel free to tell me your thoughts on the matter, but I feel like this technical jargon is a lot harder to understand than key, chord, meter. All concepts that Levin conflates with the, and I quote this directly, "arcane and rarefied set of terms and rules that are as obscure as some of the most esoteric domains of mathematics." And yet, I'm supposed to understand neuroscience jargon much easier than that? What the hell is a mesolimbic system? Nucleus accumbens sounds like some kind of wizard spell. Okay? To finally get to the first of 9 chapters, Chapter 1, What is Music, starts on page 13. And on page 13, we have my first blatant misinformation tab. This one is a favorite because Levitin here just perpetuates the age-old medieval tritone Catholic Church ban where the Catholic Church got rid of tritones. As they say, the Church also banned the musical interval of an augmented fourth, the distance between C and F sharp, and also known as a tritone, the interval in Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story when Tony sings the name Maria. This interval was considered so dissonant that it must have been the work of Lucifer, and so the Church named it Diabolus in Musica. To quickly debunk this argument, main points here, Johann Joseph Fuchs, author of probably the leading counterpoint text ever, one of the most quoted ones, I can't say it, here's the name, because I am forgetting it and didn't write it in my script. He coined that term, Diabolus in Musica. He coined that, not the Catholic Church. And nor was it ever banned. It was just hard to sing in two-voice polyphony and did not sound good when you were trying to tune it. For a very comprehensive debunk of the tritone ban myth, go watch Adam Neely's The Great Myth of the Medieval Tritone Ban. After this video, though. Got that? Alright, and after that little fiasco, he does a fairly good job, in all honesty, explaining some of the fundamental aspects of music, and then does a fairly mediocre job of explaining the rest of them. For example, my first yellow tab, which I have immediately lost, is where he attempts to describe meter. And he calls it only waltz meter and march meter. Why? Like, why? Literally, why do that? Explaining the concept of simple versus compound meter is not difficult. For example, simple meter is when tones are organized into groups of 2, and compound meter is when they are organized into groups of 3. Very simple explanation. Very easy. I literally wrote that in about 30 seconds. It's not rocket science, my guy. You don't gotta call it waltz meter and march meter. Or the concept of melody, which he describes only as, melody is the main theme of a musical piece. First point there, melodies can have There can be more than one melody in a piece, actually. This might shock you, Daniel J. Levitin, but there can be more than one melody in a piece. Especially when he goes, in classical music, the melody is a starting point for the composer to create variations on that theme, which may be used throughout the entire piece in different forms. Yeah, again, you can have more than one melody in a piece. And theme and variations is only one type of classical composition? Like, this hurts. He did define harmony quite oddly, but at this point I really already had low expectations, so I wasn't thinking about that one too much. He does touch, actually, on the tendency of Western musicians to use high versus low as a descriptor of pitch, and mentions that these are not intuitive labels, as some scientists have said. Which is a good point, actually, making about 2 total on page 21 here. And if there are, I have linked more reading on this if you're interested in other ways that pitch is described in different cultures for further reading. Again, I'll talk more about the further reading links and such at the end of the video. But as that was page 21, my next issue is page 23. I'll just put that up on the screen here and describe it for you. This is the only appearance of sheet music of any kind, and he screwed it up really badly, actually. I don't know how he managed to do that. It's incredibly visually cluttered. He somehow screwed up the spacing between the staff lines, and for those of you who don't know, staff spacing needs to be consistent, as all musical notation symbols are supposed to be based off of the distance between 2 staves, also known as stave space. And that's a proportional thing, and it needs to be consistent through every line on the stave. And he screws that up somehow. In the bass clef specifically, you'll also notice he can't be bothered to put notes in the right places on ledger lines, and all of the notes kind of overlap multiple lines, regardless of where they are. Middle C actually does not have a ledger line, which is hilarious, but very stupid. And he also includes these lines that are meant to display the ranges of instruments. It's like the tuba, the trumpet, the piccolo, as well as male and female voices. And these ranges are wrong. They're just straight up wrong. Ignoring the headache I got from trying to read this image, and the annoyance I realized, like the annoyance I had once I realized he couldn't be bothered to properly line up all this stuff, the ranges were off by a pretty significant margin, actually. So here's a good moment for me, I think, to mention that when I cited sources for this book, I made sure, for the most part, to cite sources that were available in 2006 or earlier, as this is when the first edition of this book was published. That's not true with all cases. Obviously, there's a bit more... There's some newer stuff, like the pitch differential thing that I talked about earlier, the way that people differentiate pitch. That's a more recent document. Some of the resources I've linked on Arab Persian music, which we'll get to in a little bit, are also more recent. But this, arranged by Nelson Riddle, was available in 1985, which is why I chose to sort it. It's also a personal favorite of mine. One of my favorite arranging books, orchestration textbooks, whatever you want to call it. And that's where I got most of the ranges. I think actually all of the ranges for this next section from. Piccolo is very close. He does imply the piccolo goes down to a C5, which it does, but only in super rare occasions. So for the most part, your piccolo range should only go to a D. In fact, when I was double checking this, I did manage to find a piccolo that goes down to a low B for the affordable price of... Dear God. Yeah, no. I'm not buying that. The violin range seems to imply that violins can go down to an F3, a whole step below what it can actually go to. And the upper end of that range is supposed to be C7, I believe, which is actually a major third below the practical limit for most composers of E7, with the highest actual note being able to play is D7, or A7, and then the upper actual limit being D8, when the violinist is especially proficient in terms of harmonics. That was the word I was looking for. Which is actually higher than the piano goes in this graph, so he wouldn't have been able to show it anyway. The female vocal range is listed about B4 to C6, which is kind of close, because, I mean, a female vocal range can go from anywhere to E3 to D6, depending on the singer and all of these different things. The trumpet range seems to be F3 to about B or B flat 5, which barely touches the actual top end of the trumpet's range. I mean, Depending on the player's ability, you can go up to a C7 or B flat 7, I guess. I'm thinking in trumpet terminology. And depending on the player, God, I don't even want to know where Arturo Sandoval falls on that graph. But the male vocal range he lists goes from C or D3 to about A4, which is not anywhere close, actually, to the variance in male vocal range. Speaking as a very undertrained baritone, I can hit an F below that D or C that he's pointing at. And I'm an amateur. So what does that tell you? And I know for a fact, I have a tenor friend who claims he can go up to about G5, he claims. I didn't verify that one, but I do know that they can easily go up to about C5 depending on the tenor. So tuba range listed from E1 to F or G4, which I have to say seems to be the most correct out of the bunch. And honestly, because I couldn't tell which, if any of these many sources Levitin has in the back of the book that he might have pulled this information from, I made sure to cite my own source. Arranged by Nelson Riddle. My next major issue is on page 29, where Levitin just makes the claim that most cultures arbitrarily choose their scales. You know, they're just arbitrary. People just kind of guess at them. That's a scale. You know, ignore, especially in Western music, the many mathematical proofs for scales. And, you know, if we'd ignore that, he's right. Oh, wait. You mean we shouldn't ignore the fact that since 1584 and 1585, two separate people at the same time came up with different proofs for the 12-tone equal temperament scale? Oh, that's crazy. That's obviously just an arbitrary decision, and not because people thought it was one of the best ways to approximate just intonation, you know, not at all, which is not an arbitrary idea itself, but rather the most mathematically pure method of approximating intervals based on the harmonic series of overtones, a concept proven since 1350. That must be arbitrary, or, you know, just based on tradition or something stupid, as Levitin claims. Not at all, because we understand the physics of sound, and have for, you know, a few hundred years at this point. Information on the physics and math behind tuning systems can be found on a website known as the Zen Harmonic Wiki, which I will be releasing a video on soon. Stay tuned for that if you're interested. The next issue, this time on page 30, also known as the next page, it's basically still the same paragraph, actually, and Levitin just flat out denies the concept of 24-tone equal temperament. He claims, and I quote here, "In Western music, music of the European tradition, these pitches are the only legal pitches. Most instruments are designed to play these pitches and not others," in reference to the ABC and other arbitrary labels that we place on particular frequencies. Sounds in between are considered mistakes, out of tune, unless they're used for expressive intonation. Intentionally playing something out of tune briefly to add emotional tension, or passing from one legal tone to another. What? So, you know, that must mean Ivan Wishnegrodsky's 1932 Manual of Quarter Tone Harmony is meaningless, and his compositions mean nothing, because, you know, they don't use the 12-tone scale, and everyone knows that the notes in between those don't exist, and they're not legal, they're not real. You know, and, but you might not be convinced Wishnegrodsky's not the most well-known composer. So, Mr. Levitin, that means Charles Ives, one of the most well-known composers out of the American tradition, is actually not a legal Western composer, because his three-quarter tone pieces are truly not Western art music, nor his Symphony No. 4, considered one of his greatest works, which includes a whole third piano part just for quarter tone piano. Clearly not actual Western art music, because those pitches aren't legal in Western art music, because you can only use the 12-tone scale. Right? I could go on. I won't. This is a stupid point. I also stopped throwing my books. I feel bad. Quick touches on the next two blue tabs. Levitin claims solfege is an alternative system. This probably could be a yellow one, but I was feeling vindictive after the last one. Next one claims women and men cannot speak at the same octave even if they tried. It will always be an octave apart. Dumb take. Alright, here's a doozy on page 32. An interval is the distance between two tones. The octave in Western music is subdivided into 12 logarithmically equally spaced tones. Correct. The intervallic distance between A and B, or between do and re, is called a whole step or tone. This latter term is confusing since we call any musical sound a tone. I'll use the term whole step to avoid ambiguity. The smallest division in our Western scale system cuts a whole step perceptually in half. The half step, or semitone, which is 1/12 of an octave. I'll use the word semitone because it is more common, and because there is no ambiguity about what it means. Alright, first of all, in my opinion, if you're going to use a naming system, be consistent. Whole tone, semitone are the same naming system. Half step, whole step, same naming system. Use the same one. It's about consistency. First of all, nobody calls it a tone, it's a whole tone. Or to differentiate from a semitone, it is a whole tone. You might be familiar with the concept of the whole tone scale, which nobody calls the whole step scale. I hate to break it to you. I'm very confused by this insistence that the term whole tone is confusing. I mean, it's probably the more common usage, strictly speaking, on whole tone scale. I don't recall in any instances, actually, in my reading, where music theorists insist on describing any musical sound as a tone. I will be quite honest with you when I've never heard someone say that. I don't call a snare hit a tone. It has a tone, which is a characteristic of its sound, but it isn't a tone. But it's still a clearly agreed upon musical sound, so we're obviously not using tone to describe every single musical sound. Page 33, we just kind of see Levitin's continued insistence on being ignorant of any kind of musical history, which is fascinating for someone who apparently graduated from Berklee College of Music. Levitin on this page just says the following statement, out of nowhere. If there are 12 named notes within an octave, why are there only 7 letters, or do, re, mi syllables? After centuries of being forced to eat in the servants' quarters and to use the back entrance of the castle, this may just be an invention by musicians to make non-musicians feel inadequate. What? What? Where does that come from? I don't know how to argue against this because it's just so blatantly false. It's not funny. But I'll persevere because this is page 33 of around 300. So we have so much more to cover still. And I've already recorded about half an hour of footage. The next source of mine, A History of Western Music, Burkholder, Grout, and Poliska. The following information is taken from this page, or taken from this book, the 10th edition. The medieval tone system is based on greater and lesser perfect systems of ancient Greece and the diatonic genus. The genus being a classification of ancient Greek tetrachords, which are four-note collections. Early medieval theorists used the Greek names for notes. In the late 10th century, a northern Italian treatise, Dialogus de Musica, Dialogue on Music, introduced a simple letter notation that was adopted by Guido of Arezzo and became the basis for our modern practice of naming notes using the letters A to G in every octave. Okay, so that disproves the statement Levitin just made. He seems to have just made up, you know. And fully disprove it, another quote from the same book. To facilitate sight singing, Guido of Arezzo, the inventor of the musical staff and author of the Micrologus, see last quote, introduced a set of syllables corresponding to the pattern of tones and semitones in the succession C, D, E, F, G, A. He noted that the first 6 phrases of the hymn, and I apologize for this, ut queant laxis, began on these notes in ascending order, and he used their initial syllables for the names of the steps, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. These solmization syllables, so called from sol, mi, are still used, although the most common version of the set substitutes do for ut and adds t above la. So yes, definitive proof that, you know, naming notes in solfege were not just made up to make non-musicians feel inferior, and were in fact used as teaching tools to make it easier. Thank you for just making stuff up in your book. It's so much fun to read. And I think actually now might be a good place to discuss some more of Levitin's work. His other work, specifically, A Field Guide to Lies and Statistics. In particular, in this book, Levitin discusses experts, and how they'll talk in 2 ways. Number 1, they'll review facts and evidence, they'll synthesize them, and they'll come to a conclusion. Number 2, they'll just share their opinions. In Levitin's own words, They are human, like the rest of us. They can be given to stories, to spinning loose threads of their own introspections, what-ifs and untested ideas. There's nothing wrong with this. Some good testable ideas come from this sort of associative thinking. But it should not be confused with a logical evidence-based argument. Books and articles for popular audiences by pundits and scientists often contain this kind of rampant speculation. And we buy them because we are impressed by the writer's expertise and rhetorical talent. If I was going to propose a hypothesis here, I would say this is exactly what Levitin is doing. Written by a scientist for popular audiences. We're impressed by their expertise and rhetorical skill. I'm not actually impressed by Levitin's rhetorical skill. I should make that very clear. I don't think his writing style is all that interesting at all, honestly. And if I didn't continue hate reading this, I would have stopped somewhere in the first 10 pages. He's made up a bunch of what-ifs and just wrote down some story he thought sounded reasonable without fact-checking, because it's not reasonable. In fact, I fact-checked so much of this, I can tell you that castles were barely being used in the 10th century, and most of them were still made out of wood. And he just kind of passes it off like it's not that important. You know, it's just kind of a throwaway phrase for him. It's not at all blatant misinformation about important musical history. And, you know, it's not. It's not that important, I guess. But aren't we expecting Levitin, a self-proclaimed musician, in his book about music and the brain, in the chapter that is supposed to be an introduction of the basics of music and music theory as a primer for the rest of the book, so you have a foundation to rest it on, aren't we expecting him to be truthful and accurate? How are we just supposed to trust what he says in the rest of the book? If he already feels comfortable just kind of making statements with no basis in truth in the first chapter, as Levitin himself says in his book, A Field Guide to Lies and Statistics, on page 134. When an expert has been found guilty of fraud, does it negate their expertise? Perhaps. It certainly impacts their credibility. Now that you know they've lied once, you should be on guard that they may lie again. And that exact reasoning is why you're getting this book review. Moving on to page 34, which is the next page from where we were just discussing. Levitin again disregards the idea that non-12-tone music even exists, and will continue to do so for a long time, so I'm gonna mostly stop bringing it up. I won't. But it's finally time to describe the pink tabs. There's this tactic where an author will simply say, studies say, experts say, or close analysis reveals. Or similar, you know, just kind of without citing a source. Levitin, in his other book, calls this persuasion by association. Saying, you know, if you want to snow people with counter-knowledge, one effective method is to get a whole bunch of verifiable facts right, and then only add one or two that is untrue. The ones you get right will have the ring of truth to them, and these intrepid web explorers who seek to verify them will be successful. So you just add one or two untruths to make your point, and people will haplessly go along with you. You persuade by associating bogus facts or counter-knowledge with actual facts and actual knowledge. And in order to punctuate this argument, he makes an argument revolving around 9 statements about water. I won't read them out for you, they're not important. Because the first 7 are true. That's the important part of this argument. While the last 2, 8 and 9, are not. The 9th one, I will read. Leading health researchers recommend drinking bottled water, and the majority drink bottled water themselves. He debunks this argument with the statement, well, who are the leading health researchers? I bring this up now because Levitin, on page 35, first discusses that we tune our modern 12-tone equal temperament system to A equals 44 hertz. For the most part. This is a true statement. He claims that this is arbitrary. We could tune A to whatever we like, which is also a true statement. Many people say, oh, A should equal 432. Or you'll see Baroque performances or other period performances tuning to what scholars believe was the correct representation of A equals blank hertz at that time. He then follows this with the statement, some people claim that the precise frequencies affect the overall sound of a musical piece and the sound of instruments. Another reasonable statement. But then he says, Led Zeppelin often tuned their instruments away from the modern A44 standard to give their music an uncommon sound, and perhaps to link it with the European children's folk songs that inspired many of their compositions. Where do you get that information, Levitin? because I have actively looked for information to corroborate this statement. Because, believe it or not, I am not actively trying to prove everything in this book wrong. I would like to be shown that this man could actively write things that are truthful and interesting to read. I would like to be proven wrong, actually. I would like to learn something from this book. I would like to learn something new. Unfortunately, unlike me, Levitin is not being at all upfront about his sources for most of this information. In fact, I would like to say in sources that I've seen, which will be linked, as I'll discuss later, the sources I've seen claim that Led Zeppelin did no such thing. They manipulated the speed at which the recordings were made or played to get different effects in their music. Their non-standard tunings, then, are not because they tuned their instruments to sound more like the European children's folk songs that might have inspired their music, but from the pitch changing, actually, because when you speed up or slow down an already recorded piece of music, the pitch will change. Which is something you'd think someone who's worked as a record producer for multiple years and has written articles regarding recording technology and discussing recording with recording engineers and musicians for recording engineer publications would be able to pick up on. Still on page 35. Levitin now claims that, no, the distances in a scale are not arbitrary, actually. And, they're not arbitrary at all. They're very precisely thought out. Directly contradicting the statements you used on page 29. But that's unimportant, apparently. Page 36, we have another one. In Western music, we rarely use all the notes of the chromatic scale in composition. Wrong. You literally discuss Arnold Schoenberg at least twice in this book. Okay, nice try. We go back to the pink tabs, because on page 37, Levitin says, experiments have shown young children, as well as adults, are better able to learn and memorize melodies that are drawn from scales that contain unequal distances such as this. Whose experiments have shown this? You did not mention this in your annotated bibliography in chapter 1, I don't believe. And I checked. Who are the leading health researchers, Levitin? Riddle me that. Page 38, another pink tab. For reasons that are largely cultural, we tend to associate major scales with happy or triumphant emotions, and minor scales with sad or defeated emotions. Some studies have suggested that the associations might be innate. First of all, what studies? Who is saying this? Who are the leading health researchers? Dr. Daniel J. Levitin. Who are they? Secondly, yes, we know that all songs with major scales have to be happy, and all songs in minor scales or keys must be sad, like all of these songs, which are completely in line with that statement, and not at all contradictory. Here on page 39 was the statement that made sure I would be reviewing this book. Daniel J. Levitin says on page 39, in print, in this statement, although it has been claimed that Indian and Arab Persian music use microtuning, scales with intervals much smaller than the semitone, close analysis reveals that their scales also rely on 12 or fewer tones, and the others are simply expressive variations, glissandos, and momentary passing tones, similar to the American blues tradition of sliding into a note for emotional purposes. So, first of all, Daniel J. Levitin, whose close analysis? Whose close analysis reveals this? Show me one study, okay? And then I'll tell you this. Your study's full of shit, okay, Doc? Whose study decided that, actually, they were more right than over potentially 1,000 years of music theory and music theoretical writings on these specific systems that has determined that they use more than the 12 tones that we use? Who said this? Let me know. I just want to talk, because not only do you not cite a source, this statement is blatantly false and potentially racist and or culturally imperialist. I'm the last person to be throwing around that terminology on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if you can tell, white as hell. And I frequently come up a barrier in my own research of how do I interact with music in a way that is not culturally imperialist. let's say, where I'm forcing the standards of my music and musical structure that I'm familiar with and the culture I grew up on onto music of a different musical culture and standard and tradition. Daniel J. Levitin has blown past all of these concerns and just said, nah, actually, they use 12-tone music. Yep. To counteract this, this claim that someone essentially debunked hundreds of years of music theory with no proof, I've included links to a few Indian or a few Arab or Persian music theory website resources. I cannot claim the validity of them, to be quite honest, because I am not well versed in these traditions as much as I'd like to be. I haven't had the time to delve deep into them, nor do I know someone who has studied them in depth and could lead me properly. But because, unlike Daniel J. Levitin, I believe in the openness of my sources, now I feel like would be a good time to tell you. In the description of this video, I have left my entire script with footnotes, bibliography, and links to additional readings and resources linked for anyone to read, anyone to critique, and anyone to look at. Because I think it is important to be open and truthful about sources, and I don't think the average person is too stupid to read a footnote. The next issue I'll touch on, because believe me, I've been skipping some in the name of time. I find fascinating. Levitin tells this story, here it is, tells this story on page 43 about when he was in grad school and his advisor told him about the work of another graduate student in biology. And he claims that this student, who apparently placed electrodes in the inferior colloquius of the barn owl, part of its auditory system, no clue, and then he played the owls a version of the Blue Danube Waltz, where they removed the fundamental overtone. This does illustrate an effect that we know of as the missing fundamental phenomenon, which is a well-known occurrence, because it showed the owl's brain perceived it as the original. It's science-y. But then the story gets a little strange because Levitin says, and because electrodes will put out a small electrical signal with each firing, and because firing rate is the same as the frequency of firing, as we saw above, Peter sent the output of these electrodes to a small amplifier, and played back the sound of the owl's neurons through a loudspeaker. What he heard was astonishing. The melody of the Blue Danube Waltz sang clearly from the loudspeakers. Ba-da-da-da, deet-deet, deet-deet. And he did, in fact, put the ba-da-da-da-da, deet-deet, deet-deet in there. That's not a part of the quote I added. So for once, this is one of the sources that Levitin puts into his little bibliographical notes appendix, except he actually doesn't. Levitin cites Yanada P., 1977, Electrophysiological Studies of Auditory Contexts. Dissertation Abstracts International, Section B, The Sciences and Engineering, University of Oregon, which is not the actual dissertation. Dissertation Abstracts International is a collection of abstracts of dissertations available on microfilm or as xerographic reproductions. So basically, rather than cite the actual dissertation, which I happened to find the entire actual dissertation online and read through the whole thing, he cites a book that has the abstract, which is the summary of the dissertation, essentially. And well, a lot of the actual dissertation is a little over my head because I am not a graduate biology student, nor did I take anything past the one required biology class for high school. I see no sign about a story about playing back brainwaves through an amplifier at all, actually. Which is strange, considering how much of a scientific breakthrough this would have been in 1996. It's strange because an experiment just like this was considered a major breakthrough last year in 2023. Only 17 years after this book's publication and 27 years after the dissertation's publication. What's also strange is that the only corroboration of this story that I've ever found is from people citing the story in this book. So in summary, Levitin does not cite the actual dissertation. I can find no corroboration for this story, and in 2023, it was considered a breakthrough to hear music that sounded like it was underwater, so not clear at all, which was created from a huge data set and with the help of AI. Yet another example of persuasion by association, maybe? I'm not sure, but let's just say I am getting less and less inclined to believe Daniel J. Levitin as this goes on. Page 45, I'm being a little snickety here because I'm mad and annoyed. Levitin is discussing non-pitched percussion. He picks 2 examples of pitched percussion to do so. Woodblocks, tuned to a specific set of notes, actually, and sets of woodblocks are tuned to diatonic scales. Chimes, not entirely certain what you're talking about here, but regardless what you are, they're tuned. Hate to break it to you. He also makes this term on page 47, natural instruments. That is, acoustic instruments made out of real-world materials, such as metal or wood. What? Where did you find this definition? I couldn't find this definition for the fucking life of me. For the life of me. Wouldn't that just be all physical instruments? I don't get that at all, actually. He then follows this up with a quite long discussion of a hypothetical instrument that he invented, which is a synthesizer. That's, spoiler alert, of the 3 or 4 pages he spends talking on this. It's a synthesizer. And he admits it 2 pages later, actually. So why couldn't you just describe what a synthesizer was? Because it's not hard. You literally just did it. Like 3 to 5 pages later. Why the hypothetical instrument? Did you think your audience was just too stupid to understand what a synthesizer was? Because this entire section just felt incredibly condescending, actually. Like, the entire thing. Inside the section, he also just, like, misses the point of organ registers. He's like, oh, a clever organist can manipulate the drawbars on the organ to create facsimiles of other instruments based on how the overtones work. Yeah, that's the whole point of an organ register system. That's literally the whole point of it. It's not even clever ones. You literally just push a button. Or pull a button. It is literally how the instrument is designed to work. Here's another good one. Page 52. You'll notice we're still in the first chapter. The pitches we use in music, the scales, have remained essentially unchanged since the time of the Greeks, with the exception of the development, really a refinement, of the equal-tempered scale during the time of Bach. First of all, the pitches that we use in music, the scales, that's not the same thing. Pitches are not scales. Any collection of pitches is pitches. Pitches in a specific order, that's a scale. Oh my god. Second of all, the scales we use have changed ridiculously since the time of the Greeks. Like, if not just in sheer number. Lastly, you yourself on page 35 admit that our modern system is tuned to A44, which is not a consistent, because it's well known that some European orchestras will tune to like A442 or something. You know, it's negligible almost. And that A has also just not been consistent throughout the entirety of Western history. So logically, of course, it's changed since the time of the Greeks. How can we be using the same pitches if we don't know what their tuning standard was? Or is that not completely obvious to you? We have no proof. Their music was tuned to A equals 440 hertz. They didn't even know what a hertz was. Okay? And also, the development of equal temperament tuning was not a refinement, because it's completely different from Pythagorean tuning systems that were used by the Greeks. And it guarantees that our music sounds nothing like that of the Greeks. At all. For any reason. Page 54, Levitin just claims Pierre Schaeffer invented, or if I'm saying that wrong, I apologize, invented new instruments by combining edited sounds together. That's not how an instrument works. Hate to break it to you. That's just edited sounds. That is literally all it is. You are combining 2 recorded sounds together. That's not a new instrument. That is literally just, it's 2 sounds edited together. You worked as a recording engineer. What is wrong with you? The final bit of misinformation in chapter 1 occurs on page 55. the last page of the chapter, oddly enough. Levitin claims Maurice Ravel wrote one of his most famous works, Bolero, after suffering from brain damage that impaired his ability to hear pitch. If you'll excuse me while I can consult my notes on this. There is no proof for this that I can find. Especially not in, Levitin's bibliographic notes, where he cites absolutely nothing about Ravel at all, in the slightest. In fact, I found a paper published in 2003 that directly disputes this. This paper claims that though Ravel was fighting symptoms of aphasia as early as 1927, there is no proof that it affected his compositional output. Levitin's statement on this implies that Ravel's constant repetition of the melody in Bolero was due to mental damage, completely ignoring that the piece was intended as an orchestration study, something it did phenomenally. And finally, we have reached Chapter 2, Foot Tapping, which the tagline proudly announces is discerning rhythm, loudness, and harmony. I immediately am wondering what in the hell was going on in Levitin's mind when he was writing this. Because in this entire chapter, and I will be brief on this chapter because I really cannot stomach talking about this for too long, he refuses to use any kind of music notation to describe rhythm. He does actually insist on using basically a different system of notation for every single time he does this. The shave and a haircut rhythm. He writes, "We hear a series of two notes of different lengths, long and short. The long notes are twice as long as the short ones. Long, short, short, long, long, rest, long, long." Okay, that works well enough. And then we have the Police's Every Breath You Take, where the one represents one unit of some arbitrary time, just to illustrate that the words breath and you are twice as long as the syllables ev and re, and that the word take is 4 times as long as ev or re, and twice as long as breath and you. You mean like this? Like this. The other one he tries to explain is the rhythm of the main theme to the William Tell Overture, by saying, and I quote, "Bada bump, bada bump, bada bump, bump, bump. Here I've used the da syllable for short, and the bump syllable for long." Why? Why did you have to do that? Like, at what point were you writing this and you were like, yeah, this is the easiest and most consistent way to describe the concept of rhythm? Nitpick. On page 59, Levitin calls the beat of a piece of music the tactus. I cannot find a reference of this in use since the 16th century. So he's just really particular in the music history he does understand. Following that, Levitin misrepresents tempo. As a scientist, Levitin should be aware that numbers mean nothing without their units of measurement. You can't have a tempo of 96. That's not a thing, because it doesn't tell you what that 96 means. He claims that anyone will know that 96 means 96 beats per minute. But it doesn't, because you intended this for the layperson who apparently did not understand music, because your first chapter was a primer on music theory. So Aerosmith's Walk This Way does not have a tempo of 112. It has a tempo of 112 beats per minute. Without the unit of measurement, the number is completely meaningless. There is absolutely nothing that we care about, because the number means nothing. Hotel California, if you don't clarify this, it's just completely meaningless. Hotel California has a tempo of 75? 75 what? Heartbeats per lunar cycle? 75 feet? You can't just say it has a tempo of 120. Will most musicians understand what you mean? Yes, but like I said, you are apparently aiming this book at the layperson who is too stupid to understand a footnote. Next, he cites one of his own studies, which is something he does frequently. And on page 61, he admits that the majority of people in his study were non-musicians. But he then uses this data to say, oh, even professional musicians wouldn't notice a tempo variation of this much, unless they were drummers, because drummers keep the beat when there's no conductor. First of all, Have you ever heard of the concept of chamber music? In the slightest. I guess that can't happen because nobody can keep the beat when there's no drummer or conductor. Man, that sucks. All music just doesn't work now, actually, because professional musicians can't tell when the tempo changes. Do you realize how stupid that statement sounds? And then we're back to his shenanigans. On page 64, we get this monstrosity of notation. He says exactly what they represent. You know, he says, I've used this symbol to indicate the quarter note, and the weird L-looking symbol to indicate an eighth note. And I've kept the spacing between syllables proportional to how much time is spent on them. You could explain it like that, and you couldn't use just basic sheet music notation. It's not a hard concept. You've already clearly demonstrated you know what it looks like in an earlier chapter, though you didn't demonstrate it well, so maybe I shouldn't be asking too much from you. And, you know, actually most of my issues from this chapter are just the fact that he refuses to use sheet music. Because he just seems to think that describing it differently every single time he talks about rhythm is going to somehow be more successful than explaining the concept once and using a consistent one the entire time. Page 67, another statement. There is accumulating evidence. Who's accumulating the evidence? Where is it from? Who are these leading health professionals? Please just cite a source already. I'm getting tired of you just claiming things without any actual evidence. And now we're going to skip to chapter 3, because quite honestly, the rest of the chapter is the same issues I've been talking about this entire time. Chapter 3, Behind the Curtain, Music and the Mind Machine. Let's go to page 88 is my first issue with this chapter, I think. Similarly, you can see how it is that all songs we have ever heard, and all those that will ever be created, could be made up of just 12 musical notes, ignoring octaves. Again, it is... I know I shouldn't expect growth through a book that is already published, and I'm reading... It was obviously written. There was no growth over the time this book was written, otherwise you would have been back and edited the earlier portions. But, way to erase every culture of music that does not use a 12-tone equal temperament scale. Like, absolutely phenomenal job there, including Western musical cultures, which don't use the 12-tone equal temperament scale. There's plenty of composers doing that. Indonesian gamelan music doesn't use a 12-tone equal temperament scale. African mabiras, not commonly tuned to 12-tone equal temperament unless somebody asks them to. I am genuinely just impressed about how you can ignore all non-Western music and then make these huge sweeping statements about how exactly music affects the brain. You know, I think that's fascinating. Moving on, we're talking about expectations right now, I believe. Yes. Page 92, he shows still more that he just does not understand Western music theory. In the Surprise Symphony by Haydn, Symphony number 94 in G major, second movement, Andante, the composer builds suspense by using violins in the main theme. No, he doesn't. He's not trying to build suspense. The whole point of the Surprise Symphony actually is that he's playing a quiet lullaby or a quiet theme to lull you into a sense of nothing, like lull you into a sense of complacency. That's the whole trick, because then when he hits you with a huge chord on the upbeat of a weak note, it's a shock to your system. Hence why it's a surprise. We're going to move to chapter 4, because a lot of chapter 3 is basically just hard brain sciencey stuff that I really don't understand. And a lot of it's about perception, which is actually not about music for the most part. Chapter 4 is anticipation, what we expect from Liszt and Ludacris. Yep, here's a good one. Levitin just shits on the entire Second Viennese School of Composers. You know, claims Arnold Schoenberg uses scales that deprive us of the notion of a resolution, a root to the scale, or a musical home, thus creating the illusion of no home, a music adrift, perhaps as a metaphor for 20th century existentialist existence, or just because they were trying to be contrary. I'm going to stop and debunk that before finishing the statement, because, wrong, completely wrong, actually. Second of all, we've already had this conversation about just saying things. and not have any proof for them at all, actually. Fun fact. Arnold Schoenberg and his students and peers that made up the Second Viennese School felt that tonal music was not the future of composition because it was already being weakened by the overuse of chromaticism and prolonged dissonances. And they decided to explore concepts of music that would not rely on a tonic. So yes, there's no root to the chord. Whoop-de-doo-dah, you got that one right. They were not just doing it to be contrarian. In fact, Charles Rosen's Arnold Schoenberg, which you actually cite in your sources, disputes that claim entirely. I hate to break that to you. Page 127, he again makes the Ravel claim, which I have already debunked, and again does not seem to understand the concept of an orchestration exercise. Congratulations, you are making me want to say very negative things about you. Again, we'll move to chapter 5. A lot of these later chapters, well, this chapter was very short, but a lot of these later chapters do get more into science, which I'm not a scientist. That might shock you when I introduce myself as composer and arranger. Not much of a science guy. Chapter 5, you know my name, look up the number. How we categorize music. There's only one claim in this chapter that I'm upset by. Oh, I should use the tabs. Alright, we're in chapter 5 still. Ask a performer to begin playing from a few notes before or after a natural phrase boundary. And she can usually not do it, even when reading from a score. I would like to present my source for this one. Me. Actually, any competent musician can do this. I have no clue why you think that this is not the case at all, actually. Where did you get this idea? It makes the most sense to start at natural phrase boundaries. Yes, because those are, in essence, what we think of as sentences in language. You know, it makes more sense to say a sentence through rather than start in the middle. Because the context is important. But proof of him being wrong, I can play an instrument, I can read sheet music, I can start in the middle of the phrase. I don't need to prove that. Chapter 6. After dessert, Crick was still 4 seats away from me. Music, emotion, and the reptilian brain. Page 171. Please, for the love of God, learn how to use sheet music. Chapter 7. What makes a musician? Expertise dissected. Yeah, that's how you say that word. In this one, Levitin makes the claim that he talked to one of the deans of the top music schools in North America and asked, why don't you teach expression in your curriculum? And the dean said, we just don't got enough time. First of all, I challenge you to go out and find any music professor who does not believe in the idea that all music should be taught with expression, always, constantly. You shouldn't need to teach at a music school how to play with expression, because if you're going to music school, you should be able to do that already. It's a very basic concept to put your emotion into music. I go to a music school right now. I am getting a degree in the next few weeks. I'm getting my bachelor's degree in music. And guess what? They've made the time to teach expression. They've worked it into small lessons. They've thrown it out there as part of a rehearsal. And if they can do it, I guarantee you, dean of whichever top music school this is, there's time in your curriculum to do this. Of course, Levitin never explains which dean he was talking to or which school they taught at. So, yet again, no source cited. Thank you for making something up, essentially. Chapter 8 is our next stop, because a lot of this is... when I was in music school at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. Chapter 8, My Favorite Things. Why do we like the music we like? In this one, Levitin finally cites a source. A bit mean to me, he has said names before. But he just kind of claims this source invented 11-tone equal temperament and 7-tone equal temperament. Or even non-linear divisions of the octave in 11 or 7 tones. Not true in the slightest. They did not probably invent these scales. I really hate to break that to you. He also asserts that the song Swingin' on a Star, which he incorrectly titled Would You Like to Swing on a Star, was a novelty song written for kids. No, Daniel J. Levitin, this well-known jazz vocal piece and award-winning piece of music was written for the film, in 1944 film, Going My Way. So yeah, again, with the just making things up, it's driving me mad by now. And then we are on... Oh, here is one thing I think was interesting. On page 245, I'm actually going to talk about something I think Levitin did well. Where did it go? As internet radio and personal music players are becoming more popular, I think that we will be seeing personalized music stations in the next few years, in which everyone can have his or her own personal music station. Personal radio station, controlled by computer algorithms that play us a mixture of music we already know and like, and a mixture of music we don't know but are likely to enjoy. That was actually a pretty spot-on prediction. I'm very impressed by that, actually. Good for you. And now we hit the last chapter, chapter 9, The Music Instinct, Evolution's #1 hit. And here was the claim I found personally insulting, actually. Contemporary classical music is practiced mostly in universities. It is regrettably listened to by almost no one compared to popular music. Much of it deconstructs harmony, melody, and rhythm, rendering them all but unrecognizable. In its least accessible form, it is a purely intellectual exercise, and save for the rare avant-garde ballet company, no one dances to it either. I'm going to say 2 words right now. Neoclassical, neo-romantic. Movements have been around for a lot longer than the 2000s, my guy. I hate to break it to you, people have been writing tonal music for as long as it's existed. The claim that nobody writes modern music that people listen to. Plenty of brand new jazz composers out there writing dance music. Hell, I do it. And I'm sure you'll find people writing tonal music for ballet companies. And I know for a fact, new music is explored outside of the realms of just the university. Really, you did absolutely zero research on this in the slightest, and it's very obvious. But good for you for perpetuating the claim that all modern music is boring, stupid, and basically an intellectual exercise. I find that really, really nice of you and really easy to enjoy. It's not just a direct insult to every composer born after Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart. Chapter 9 ends with this page, and to be quite honest with you, it's not really a conclusion to the book. My note, like I have a sticky note on here, and it just says, is this supposed to be a conclusion? This is conjecture, and not even good conjecture. I didn't get it. This was not a fulfilling end to what was essentially a very bad book. Appendix A, this is your brain on music, is essentially 2 illustrations of the brain. They're not very good ones, as far as I can tell. And they really don't explain anything or make it easier to understand anything, actually. There is no explanation of how any of this works in context, and it's actually just very confusing to look at. Appendix B is called Chords and Harmony, and includes one of the most frustrating mistakes I've ever seen made, because Daniel J. Levitin gets rhythm changes wrong. For those of you who don't know, rhythm changes is a set of chord changes that are very prominent in jazz music, based off of the tune I Got Rhythm by George Gershwin. Levitin lists what he calls the basic chords. And they're incorrect. They're actually wrong. So good job about that one. Actually, don't take my word for it. Compare for yourself. He doesn't even include the bridge. After that, actually, we get to bibliographic notes, which is what I think he claims substitutes for a bibliography. The first issue with this is that he tells us, off the bat, that it's incomplete. The following are some of the many articles and books I have consulted. This list is by no means complete, but represents additional sources that are most relevant to the points made in this book. He also says, this book was written for the non-specialists and not for my colleagues, and so I have tried to simplify simplify topics without oversimplifying them. A more complete and detailed account of the brain and music can be found in these readings, and in the readings cited in them. This does not exclude you, Daniel J. Levitin, from citing actual sources and having having evidence for your claims. You know, you're like, oh, this isn't a complete list. Then why didn't you include the actual evidence behind some of the statements you were making? It's not hard to do a bibliography. I wrote one for this video. It wasn't rocket science. I didn't even end up using all the books you used, because everything except for 2 books you cited, everything except for 4 books you cited, arguably couldn't even be called a music book. There are exactly 2 books on music theory. 3 or 4 if you're being very nice. I can't read the Pierre Schaeffer ones because they're in French, and I don't speak French very well. I hope my French professor doesn't see this. And then there's a book on Arnold Schoenberg, which is a biography. So yeah, 4 or 5 of these sources are actually books about music, or composers, or musicians. Meanwhile, Levitin cites his own work, or the work he's edited or contributed to, or part of, journals he edits for, a total of 44 times. Potentially up to 11 times the amount of books he actually cited about music. 13% of his sources, or should I say citations, because sometimes he cites the same source more than once, 13% of this is either his work or work he has had a direct influence on. And I didn't even count the ones by people he's admitted are close friends and he's contributed to or helped in the writing of those books, because his name was not on them. Barely over 1% of his sources in his book that purports to discuss music and the brain are actually about music. After that, there's an index and an excerpt from another book of his, which, to be quite honest with you, I could not care less about. I will not be reading it. So if we follow the normal structure of my book reviews, right now would be accessibility. But I can tell you this. If my mom can find this book and buy it, anyone can find this book and buy it. It's not hard. So I'd rather just tell you my final opinions now. To read out of my notes a little bit. If you haven't figured it out yet, I don't like this book. It's full of misinformation and just seems generally misleading. I can't imagine going into this as someone who didn't know anything about music and coming out with an accurate view based on this. Levitin perpetuates nonsense concepts under the disguise of funny, under the disguise of opinion, or a funny, maybe this is the case. It's disgusting. For someone who puts a lot of emphasis on peer review in his book, A Field Guide to Lies and Statistics, it sure seems like he never bothered to run this past someone who was trained as a musician or even passed a music history course. I can't really comment on the actual brain science he discusses in this book, because for one, I don't have a doctorate in neuroscience, and despite his many claims that he was attempting to simplify concepts without oversimplifying them, he throws in so much technical terminology without bothering to explain much of it, something he complained musicians and music theorists do, and that was hard to get through. Along with this, I find the complete lack of actually cited sources upsetting. It's not hard to read and understand a footnote, and not actually citing sources when you say experts have found or close analysis reveals seems purposefully disingenuous. Now you may say, oh, he's got a bibliography. No, he's got what he calls bibliographic notes. To quote his description of it, I've read that part already for you. He doesn't cite any specific sources in the chapters, and consulting in the relevant sections in the bibliographic notes is seldom outright tells you what it's supposed to be a source for. Occasionally it does, but it's harder than not to find out what he's trying to talk about. And as I've discussed earlier, he doesn't even do a good job of that because he managed to cite the wrong source more than once. And there are hardly any books on actual music theory or music, rather than just music's effect on the brain. So I have to question, how can someone who clearly doesn't understand much about music or actual music theory, how can someone like that decide how it affects the brain? I want to be fair here and mention that despite what I say, regardless of what I say, Levitin is a musician. He's recorded and released 2 of his own albums and several other singles, which I did force myself to listen to his most recent album, and while I can't say it was god-awful, I can say I didn't like it. But in my opinion on that does not make him any less of a musician. He claims to have a fairly large list of rather big musicians he's played with in the past, and honestly, if that's true. But back to his book. Much like his music, while it is for the most part technically competently written, I can't stand it. There's this weird underlying sense of condescension, Like Levitin doesn't believe you're smart enough to understand some of these concepts, but also doesn't bother to explain them to you. And his appendixes, A and B, really don't do anything to help at all, because one is just two pictures of the brain, which didn't make any sense to me, and the other is an incorrect explanation of harmony in chords. To sum everything up, because I've been rambling for an hour and 24 minutes in this recording session so far, and the actual time of this video you can see in the timestamp, I do not recommend this book. I didn't like it. I think it's full of misinformation, and essentially I don't trust Daniel J. Levitin to be truthful about any of the information he's giving us, because time after time I've researched myself and proven that he was wrong about the things he was saying. And because I know he didn't bother to fact check what he said about music, how can I be certain, as someone who doesn't have the expertise to figure it out, if what he was saying about the brain was true? You know, it comes down back to that key statement Levitin made earlier. When an expert has been found guilty of fraud, does it negate their expertise? Perhaps. It certainly impacts their credibility. Now that you know they've lied once, you should be on guard that they may lie again. And in all honesty, that statement kind of sums up how I feel about the book. I can't trust them to be truthful. So I do not recommend you buy this book. And I would highly recommend that if you know someone who is interested in it, warn them off. There's better things you can spend your money on. And as I said earlier, to be transparent as possible, I'll be releasing a copy of my script for this video, complete with my beginning editing notes, which I always work into my scripts because I think it's fun, as well as sources cited and links to additional resources and reading, or the digital links to some of the sources I referenced in the creation of this video. I do think that you can probably read and understand footnotes, and I want to be very honest that if you find something in your research that contradicts what I've said, and you have enough evidence to back it up, I will gladly issue some kind of small retraction, probably in the comment section of this video, in a pinned comment or something similar. You know, if you find something that contradicts something I've said in this video, feel free to reach out to me. Leave a comment, or I'll correct myself in a pinned comment if you can provide evidence, of course. So if something comes up, please feel free to check for a pinned comment on the video below, where I'll clarify my corrections. Feel free as well, though, to just leave your opinion on the book. If you've read it before, I'd love to hear what you thought before I kind of just threw all this at you. Feel free to leave your opinion on the book, or the things I've said in this video. I'm always open to discussing the books I've read, and I'm always happy to hear others' thoughts as well. It can be an enlightening thing to see, oh, you know, I felt the need to create this huge, basically rebuttal to this book, but someone else might have just read it and enjoyed it, and thought, you know, that's kind of neat. And I always love hearing that kind of thing. And with that, you know, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Check out my other videos. Feel free to stick around for the upcoming Zen Harmonic Wiki review that I'm planning on releasing soon. Or check out any of my other reviews if you found this one interesting. And yeah, that's all. So thanks. I'll see you next time. I need a drink.